Imagine being born into a world where your future has already been decided. You are born into royalty, surrounded by wealth, temples, servants, and people who believe they know exactly what you will become. But there is one problem. The throne is not meant for you. You are expected to become a wife, a mother, and a queen beside a king. Now imagine deciding that this will not be enough. More than 3,000 years ago, along the banks of the Nile, ancient Egypt stood as one of the most powerful civilizations on earth. Its temples reached toward the sky. Its priests served powerful gods. Its kings were treated as divine rulers, responsible for maintaining order between the human world and the gods. Into this world, during Egypt's 18th dynasty, a royal daughter named Hatshepsut was born. Her father was Thutmose I, a powerful pharaoh who had expanded Egypt's influence through military campaigns. Her mother was Ahmose, a woman of the royal family who gave Hatshepsut a direct connection to Egypt's ruling dynasty. Hatshepsut grew up inside the royal court, learning the traditions, religion, and responsibilities expected of someone born into the family of a pharaoh. She was not an outsider looking toward the throne. She was already part of the world that produced Egypt's rulers. But she was a daughter. And in the world she was born into, that difference mattered. Hatshepsut could not yet know it, but the path waiting for her would eventually take her somewhere no Egyptian woman had ever gone before. Hatshepsut grew up inside the royal court of Egypt, surrounded by the people who controlled the kingdom's temples, armies, wealth, and administration. Her childhood was very different from that of an ordinary Egyptian girl. She belonged to the ruling family. Her father, Thutmose I, had strengthened Egypt through military campaigns and expanded its influence beyond the Nile Valley. His victories brought wealth and prestige to the royal court. Hatshepsut would have grown up seeing the machinery of kingship around her, the ceremonies, the priests, the officials, and the rituals that connected the pharaoh to the gods. She was also closely connected to Egypt's religious life. The great god Ammonius was becoming increasingly important at Thebes, the royal center where Hatshepsut's family held power. As a royal daughter, she was prepared for an important position within this world. But she was not being prepared to become pharaoh. Her future was expected to follow the traditions of the royal family. She would marry within the dynasty, strengthen the royal bloodline, and eventually become a queen. Then, while Hatshepsut was still young, her father died. The throne passed to her half-brother, Thutmose II. Hatshepsut married him and became his great royal wife. She now stood beside the king, close to the center of Egyptian power. But the marriage would not simply determine her position as queen. It would place her at the heart of a succession crisis that would eventually change the course of her life. Because Thutmose II would die, and the next person to inherit the throne would be only a child. Thutmose II did not reign for long. When he died, the throne passed to his young son, Thutmose III. But the new king was still a child. Egypt now faced a delicate situation. A child sat upon the throne, while the kingdom still needed an adult to govern it. That responsibility fell to Hatshepsut. As Thutmose III's stepmother and his father's great royal wife, she became regent, ruling Egypt on behalf of the young king. At first, Hatshepsut did not replace Thutmose III. She governed for him. She stood at the center of the royal court, issuing commands, overseeing officials, and protecting the stability of the kingdom. The position gave her enormous responsibility, but it also gave her something few women in Egyptian history had ever possessed: direct experience of ruling the state. Hatshepsut proved capable of handling that responsibility. She worked with powerful officials, maintained the religious institutions, and continued the traditions of Egyptian kingship. Meanwhile, Thutmose III grew older, and Hatshepsut's position began to change. She was no longer simply the queen who stood beside a king. She had become the person exercising real authority. Then, around 1473 BC, Hatshepsut took a remarkable step. She adopted the full titles and ceremonial symbols traditionally associated with an Egyptian king. She was no longer presenting herself merely as regent. She was presenting herself as Pharaoh. The decision changed everything. A royal woman who had entered the throne room as queen was now claiming the throne itself. Hatshepsut's decision to become pharaoh required more than simply taking a title. She had to make Egypt accept her authority. So she began presenting herself in the traditional language of kingship. Her official inscriptions gave her the full royal titles normally carried by a pharaoh. Artists portrayed her wearing the Nemes headdress, the royal crown, and sometimes the ceremonial false beard associated with kings. These images were not simply about appearance. They told every priest, official, soldier, and citizen who saw them that Hatshepsut was the ruler of Egypt. But Hatshepsut also built her legitimacy through religion. She connected her rule closely to Ammonius, the great god of Thebes, and presented herself as chosen by the divine order that Egyptians believed sustained the kingdom. Her monuments proclaimed that her authority was not an accident. She belonged on the throne. At the same time, Thutmose III remained part of the royal system. Hatshepsut did not erase him from Egypt's official history. He continued to hold the title of king, while Hatshepsut exercised supreme authority. For nearly 2 decades, they existed within the same royal order. But Hatshepsut's power was now unmistakable. She had crossed a boundary that Egyptian tradition rarely allowed women to cross. She was no longer simply the mother figure protecting a young king. She was the pharaoh herself. And now she had to prove that her rule could bring Egypt something every successful pharaoh needed: prosperity, stability, and greatness. Hatshepsut would pursue all three through an ambitious program of building, trade, and royal display. Her first great statement would rise from the cliffs of western Thebes. Hatshepsut understood that a pharaoh's power had to be seen. So she began transforming the landscape of Egypt. At Deir el-Bahari, on the western bank of the Nile near Thebes, she ordered a magnificent mortuary temple built beneath the cliffs. Its terraces rose toward the mountainside in a series of grand platforms, connected by ramps and lined with columns. The temple was more than a place of worship. It was a statement. Hatshepsut placed her achievements into stone, ensuring that future generations would know who had ruled Egypt. Across the kingdom, she commissioned additional construction projects and restored older monuments that had been damaged during earlier periods of instability. At Karnak, she dedicated monuments to Ammonius and erected enormous granite obelisks. One of them still stands today. Its polished surface once caught the sunlight above the temple complex, turning Hatshepsut's name into a message visible for generations. But Hatshepsut's ambitions reached beyond construction. Egypt needed wealth, and one of the best ways to obtain it was through trade. So she turned her attention toward a distant land known to the Egyptians as Punt. Punt lay somewhere beyond Egypt's southern trade routes, across the Red Sea region. Egyptian traders had sought its valuable goods for generations, especially aromatic products used in temples and religious ceremonies. Hatshepsut wanted more than a small shipment. She wanted a major expedition. Ships were prepared. Sailors were assembled. And Egyptian officials recorded the preparations carefully. Soon, A fleet would leave Egypt and sail toward a distant land that had become almost legendary to the Egyptians. What returned would become one of the most famous achievements of Hatshepsut's reign. The ships left Egypt and sailed southward along the Red Sea. On board were sailors, officials, and traders carrying goods from the Egyptian kingdom. Their destination was Punt, a distant trading region whose exact location remains uncertain, but which was reached through the Red Sea trade routes. The journey was important because Punt offered products that Egypt could not easily obtain from the Nile Valley. When the Egyptian expedition arrived, the travelers encountered a land rich in valuable resources. They traded for frankincense and myrrh, along with gold, ebony, ivory, aromatic woods, and other luxury goods. The Egyptians even brought back living frankincense trees, carefully transported so they could be planted in Egypt. The expedition was recorded on the walls of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari. There, the artists showed the ships, the foreign settlement, the exchange of goods, and the return journey. For Hatshepsut, this expedition became more than a successful trading mission. It demonstrated that Egypt under her rule could reach distant lands, bring wealth back to the kingdom, and maintain peaceful commercial relationships beyond its borders. The treasures returned to Egypt. The incense could be offered in temples. The exotic materials could be used by craftsmen. And the story of the expedition could be carved permanently into stone. Hatshepsut was building something that would outlast her reign. Not merely monuments, but evidence of what her government had accomplished. Egypt was prosperous. Her temples were rising. Her name was being carved into stone. And her authority appeared secure. But while Hatshepsut ruled from the throne, the young king who had once needed her protection was growing older. Thutmose III was becoming a man. And eventually he would inherit Egypt alone. As the years passed, Hatshepsut's authority became firmly established. She had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades, overseeing a period marked by construction, trade, and relative stability. Her monuments stood across the kingdom. Her officials carried out her commands. Her name was closely connected with the powerful god Ammonius, strengthening her position as Egypt's legitimate ruler. One of the officials closest to her was Senenmut, who supervised important royal projects and became a powerful figure within her government. Hatshepsut continued Egypt's military responsibilities, but her reign became especially famous for what she built and what she brought into Egypt through trade. The wealth from distant lands supported temples, craftsmen, priests, and enormous building projects. At the center of this prosperity stood Hatshepsut. She had entered power as a regent, protecting a young king. Now she was an established pharaoh, ruling Egypt in her own right. But her reign could not last forever. Around 1458 BC, Hatshepsut died. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings, a remarkable resting place for a woman who had ruled Egypt as king. After her death, Thutmose III became the undisputed ruler. At first, Hatshepsut's monuments remained. Then something changed. Her statues were destroyed. Her name was removed from some monuments. Her images were damaged or replaced. The pharaoh who had spent her reign carving her achievements into stone was about to be deliberately pushed into the shadows of history. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III ruled Egypt alone. For years, the monuments Hatshepsut had built continued to stand across the kingdom. Then her images began to disappear. At Karnak, statues of Hatshepsut were dismantled and buried or reused. At Deir el-Bahari, her royal images were damaged, and some of her inscriptions were removed or covered. Her name was also omitted from some later royal records. The result was remarkable. A woman who had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades gradually vanished from the official memory of the kingdom. But the destruction was not complete. Her great temple survived. Some inscriptions remained hidden beneath later construction. And beneath the damage, her name was still waiting to be discovered. Centuries passed. Egypt changed hands. Its temples fell into ruin. Sand covered parts of its ancient monuments. The civilization that Hatshepsut had ruled became a subject of archaeology rather than living memory. Then, in the modern era, archaeologists began studying the ruins of Deir el-Bahari. The inscriptions revealed the identity of the ruler who had built the magnificent temple. Hatshepsut's story slowly returned. The forgotten queen was no longer simply a mysterious name. She had been a powerful pharaoh who had ruled Egypt, built enormous monuments, expanded trade, and left behind one of the most remarkable royal legacies of the new kingdom. The attempt to erase her had failed. Stone had remembered what people had tried to forget. And the woman who once stood at the center of Egypt's power was finally returning to history.